let's jump into another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something a little different.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at how a philosophy called Quinean holism
Okay.
can actually help us understand the inner workings of further education colleges.
First.
And specifically, we're going to be focusing on their governance.
Okay.
Now, you might not have heard of Quinean holism before, but bear with us because it's really fascinating, and it might actually change the way that you see decision-making in really any kind of complex organization, but particularly for FE colleges.
It is fascinating to see how these concepts apply to a real-world situation like that.
Right.
And we have some sources that go into the specifics of how ECI colleges work and how looking at it through this Quinean lens can really be revealing.
Yeah. So before we get into the complexities of FE governance, can you kind of paint a picture for us? Like, what exactly is Quinean holism?
Okay, so imagine you have like a detective's evidence board, right?
Yeah.
And it's covered in photos and notes, and there's red string connecting it all.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of Quinean holism in a nutshell.
Okay.
It's the idea that no piece of information exists in isolation.
Okay.
Every fact, every decision, every observation, it only makes sense when you see how it connects to the bigger picture.
So instead of like examining each decision in a vacuum,
Right.
you're saying we need to consider like the whole web, right? The entire web of belief.
Yes, the web of belief.
All the different interconnected factors that influence how things work in a FE college.
Exactly. And that's actually where a lot of traditional approaches to understanding governance can fall short.
Okay.
Because they try to isolate variables.
Okay.
So they might look at just funding, or they might look at just leadership styles or whatever.
Right.
But they're not taking that broader context into account.
So it's like trying to understand a play by only watching like one actor.
Yeah.
And not seeing the whole performance or the set design or hearing any of the dialogue or anything like that.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
One of our sources gives a really good example of this.
Okay.
Let's say a college decides to cut funding for a specific program.
Right.
On the surface, that might seem like a purely negative decision, right?
Yeah, it'd be very easy to jump to that conclusion.
Especially if you're just looking at the immediate financial implications.
Right.
But a Quinean perspective might reveal a totally different story.
Okay.
Perhaps that funding cut forces the college to reevaluate the program's effectiveness.
Okay.
Maybe lead to a more focused and ultimately a more sustainable model.
So what initially appears as like a setback could actually be the catalyst for some kind of positive change.
Right.
It all depends on how you view it within that larger context of the institution.
Exactly.
Okay.
Quinean holism basically urges us to resist those knee-jerk reactions and instead, to consider the interconnectedness of everything within that college's ecosystem.
Right, and that kind of brings to mind something else that our sources discuss, and that is this tension between what governance should be, those ideal principles that we strive for, and then what it actually is in practice, like on the ground.
Yes, it's that classic dilemma.
Right.
We have these lofty goals like ethical leadership and transparency and accountability, but then we're faced with the reality of limited budgets and internal politics and all these competing priorities.
And our sources, they use frameworks like the Nolan Principles, the Cadbury Code as examples.
Yeah.
These outline aspirational guidelines for good governance, but how those principles are then interpreted and implemented, that's where things get really interesting.
That's where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah.
And that's also where Quinean holism can be helpful.
Okay.
Because it helps us to bridge that gap between those aspirations and reality. It allows us to acknowledge the importance of those ideals while also recognizing that their execution is always going to be shaped by, all the complexities of the real world.
So for someone working within an FE college, this means understanding that governance isn't just about following a checklist or, ticking boxes.
It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Right. It's about recognizing those aspirational goals and then figuring out how to navigate the real-world constraints to actually make them work.
It's about understanding how those decisions play out in the context of the whole web, not just as isolated events.
I'm starting to see how this Quinean approach can be really helpful in untangling all these complexities.
It really encourages us to move beyond those simplistic explanations and to really embrace the intricate dynamics of these colleges.
And that kind of leads us to something that I found particularly thought-provoking.
Okay.
It seems to challenge a lot of assumptions about how we measure success.
Okay.
Our sources discuss Quine's rejection of something called the verification principle. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, sure. So it essentially boils down to this. Not everything needs a neatly measurable outcome to be valuable.
Okay.
So it's pushing back against this idea that something is only meaningful if you can immediately quantify its impact.
Mm-hmm.
And this is particularly relevant when we're talking about governance.
Right.
Because we can't always expect these quick, easy-to-measure results from every governance decision.
Especially in an environment as dynamic and multifaceted as an FE college.
Exactly. And our sources highlight this with a really specific example.
Okay.
Let's say a college makes this really tough decision to restructure its departments.
Huh.
Initially, people might just see that as a cost-cutting measure.
Right.
Like they're just trying to save money.
Yeah.
But down the line, it might turn out that this restructuring perfectly positions the college to meet the evolving needs of the workforce.
So it's like Quinean holism helps us take that long view. It encourages us to look beyond just those immediate outcomes and understand how decisions can have unintended but ultimately beneficial consequences.
Yeah, it encourages us to see those consequences as part of that web of belief.
Right.
Rather than just anomalies or failures.
Right.
It's a much more dynamic way of understanding how things work.
No, I have to ask, and I'm sure our listeners are wondering the same thing.
Okay.
If we really want to understand F governance,
Yeah.
why not just peek behind the curtain?
Right.
Why not observe those board meetings directly?
It's a logical question.
Yeah.
But there's a really interesting Quinean perspective on that.
Okay.
You see, by inserting ourselves directly into the system, we risk actually altering the very thing that we're trying to observe.
It's like that old saying, a watched pot never boils.
Exactly.
All right.
So by trying to get too close,
Yeah.
we might inadvertently influence the behavior of the board members.
Right.
And that would skew our understanding of how that decision-making process actually works.
So from a Quinean perspective, it's more about understanding the system as a whole.
Yes.
And that might mean relying on a broader set of evidence, like interviews or policy documents or historical data.
It's about looking at multiple sources of information.
Yeah, so instead of just relying on that single point of observation, we're building that detectives board that you mentioned earlier, piecing together a more complete picture from different angles.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And that actually strengthens the case for this whole Quinean approach.
Okay.
It's not just an abstract philosophical idea.
Right.
It actually provides a framework for how we can approach research and analysis in these very complex environments.
Interesting. Yeah.
So,
our speakers will be right back.
There are issues to resolve in every organization, even successful ones. One issue that stands out is learning and learning culture. So many organizations get this step wrong, concerning themselves with compliance instead of confidence, competence, and high performance. Grow your confidence, competence, and potential for high performance with Daniel Scully and DLS Education. Go to dlseducation.uk or sculling.ie. That's dlseducation.uk or sculling.ie.
Now we will return to our podcast, Beyond Observation.
And welcome back to our exploration of Quinean holism and how it can help us understand FE governance.
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff.
It is.
Before we went to the break, we were talking about how this framework really encourages us to kind of embrace ambiguity and complexity as kind of inherent features of these organizations.
Yeah, it's not about trying to oversimplify things.
Right.
It's about recognizing that there are going to be multiple perspectives.
Right, and acknowledging that web of belief kind of helps us see governance as this dynamic process with all these different viewpoints shaping how things actually work.
Exactly. And this actually leads us to another really fascinating concept that Quinean explored.
Okay.
It's called the indeterminacy of translation.
Indeterminacy of translation.
It sounds a bit technical, but it really beautifully illustrates a challenge that I think FE leaders face every day.
Okay, I'm all ears. How does indeterminacy of translation play into the daily running of an FE college?
Well, think about the nuances of language, right? When we translate something, even a simple phrase, from one language to another, there's rarely a perfect one-to-one correspondence.
Okay.
Words carry different connotations.
Right.
Cultural context adds layers of meaning.
Yeah.
Interpretation plays a huge role.
So even when we strive for clarity
Right.
in how we're communicating something,
Yeah.
there's still that potential for misunderstanding based on how the receiver's interpreting it.
Absolutely.
And their own web of belief.
Their own web of belief, exactly.
Yeah.
And this is even more amplified in a setting like FE governance,
Yeah.
where you have this incredibly diverse group of stakeholders.
Right.
You have students, you have faculty, you have staff, you have community members, governing bodies.
Yeah.
All these different people with their own backgrounds and experiences.
Right. So the same decision
Yes.
could be perceived
Yeah.
in vastly different ways.
In vastly different ways.
By all these different groups.
Absolutely.
What might seem like a really positive step forward for one group
Right.
could be interpreted as a setback or even a threat by another group.
That's like that old saying, one person's trash is another person's treasure.
Yeah, exactly.
And our sources give a really insightful example of this.
Okay.
Imagine a college decides to revamp its curriculum.
Okay.
Some people might see that as a really strategic alignment with current industry needs, benefiting students and future employers.
Right.
But other people, maybe longtime faculty members,
Yep.
they might see it as an erosion of academic rigor
Okay.
or a disregard for the value of existing programs.
So you're saying neither interpretation is inherently right or wrong.
Exactly.
It's about understanding that each perspective is kind of valid within its own context.
It's about recognizing that there are multiple valid interpretations.
Right. Within that individual's or that group's
Yeah.
web of belief.
Web of belief, exactly.
Right.
And I think that's where the real work of governance begins.
Okay.
It's less about finding a singular correct answer,
Right.
and more about navigating these diverse viewpoints,
Okay.
fostering open dialogue,
Mm-hmm.
and seeking common ground.
So Quinean holism isn't just about analyzing a complex system from some kind of detached, objective standpoint.
No.
It's about recognizing that human element, understanding that governance is inherently subjective
Yeah.
and shaped by the very people who comprise that system.
Absolutely.
It really makes you kind of rethink how we approach leadership and decision making.
Yeah.
It seems less about imposing a top-down vision
Yeah.
and more about creating space for these different interpretations to coexist and then inform a more nuanced approach.
It's about shifting from a mindset of control to a mindset of understanding.
Okay, so our sources also touch on how Quinean holism can be applied to the research process itself.
Yes.
How does this philosophy kind of influence the way that we study and analyze something like FE governance?
Well, that's where that web of belief really comes into play.
Okay.
One of our sources emphasizes that instead of relying on a single data point
Okay.
or a very narrow perspective,
Mhm.
researchers should draw on a variety of evidence
Okay.
to form a more holistic understanding.
So it's not just about crunching numbers
Right.
or doing surveys.
It's about gathering information from a variety of sources.
Right. So interviews, policy documents, historical data, even anecdotal observations.
Exactly. It's like piecing together a puzzle
Okay.
where each piece of information adds a layer to the overall picture.
Yeah. It reminds me of those investigative podcasts
Okay.
where they use a combination of forensic evidence and witness testimonies and historical records
Yeah.
to try to uncover the truth.
And each element kind of contributes to this richer, more comprehensive understanding
Yeah.
of the event.
And it sounds like in this case with FE governance
Yeah.
that the analysis is kind of ongoing, right?
It is. It's an ongoing process.
So it's not just we collect the data
Okay. Right.
and then arrive at some kind of fixed conclusion.
Right. We're constantly revisiting our interpretations,
Right.
testing them against new information, and just refining our understanding.
So this is an important takeaway for our listeners, especially those who are involved in research or decision making
Yeah.
within FE colleges, that it kind of encourages a sense of
Yeah.
continuous learning.
Yes. Continuous learning and adaptation.
And acknowledging that our understanding of these complex systems is always evolving.
It's an ongoing process. Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, we've really explored the theory,
Mm-hmm.
the research methods, the human element at play
Right.
in these complex organizations.
We've seen how this framework really pushes us to think beyond those simple solutions and embrace these different viewpoints
Right.
and acknowledge that our understanding is always evolving.
Yeah. So for the final piece of the puzzle here, how can we actually apply all of this to leadership and decision making in FE colleges?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Right. And our sources do offer some concrete takeaways, which I'm excited to dig into.
Yeah, and they highlight this importance of viewing governance as a dynamic process rather than a rigid structure.
Okay.
And this really aligns with that Quinean emphasis on interconnectedness.
Right.
And the idea that our webs of belief are constantly being revised in light of new information.
So instead of searching for like that one perfect governance model, it's about building a system that's adaptable.
Yes, it's about adaptability.
And responsiveness.
And responsiveness to the ever-changing landscape.
Yeah, it's about being flexible and being able to respond to new challenges as they arise.
Of the FE sector.
Exactly. And one of our sources puts it this way.
Okay.
They say that FE governance is not a destination. It's a journey.
Okay.
So it's not about reaching some endpoint.
Right.
It's about this continuous process of learning and adapting.
Right. And that reminds me of something we talked about earlier.
This rejection of the verification principle.
Yes.
We can't always expect these immediate measurable outcomes from every decision.
Yeah, it's about taking that long view.
Right.
And that actually leads to another key takeaway.
Okay.
Which is the importance of systems thinking in leadership.
Okay, so what does that mean? Systems thinking.
So it's about understanding that decisions don't happen in isolation.
Okay.
They have ripple effects.
Yeah.
They impact various stakeholders in different parts of the college in sometimes unexpected ways.
So before implementing any new policy or initiative, leaders need to consider not just that immediate impact, but also those potential long-term consequences.
Yes, the unintended consequences.
For different parts of the college ecosystem.
Exactly. And one of our sources uses this great metaphor to illustrate this point.
Okay.
They say that leading an FE college is like conducting an orchestra. You have all these different sections, right?
Right.
You have the faculty, you have the staff.
The students.
The administration.
Yeah.
Each playing their own part.
Right.
And a skilled conductor understands how each section contributes to the overall harmony.
Okay.
And makes adjustments accordingly.
That's a beautiful analogy.
It really highlights that interconnectedness, right?
Yeah.
The need for a holistic perspective.
It does, and it leads to another takeaway.
Okay.
That kind of emerges from our sources.
Yes.
Which is this importance of embracing ambiguity and complexity.
Right.
As kind of inherent features.
Yes, as part of the game.
Of FE governance.
Yeah. We have to remember that there's rarely one right answer. And different stakeholders are going to have varying perspectives on the same issues.
So instead of trying to control and oversimplify, leaders should cultivate a culture of open dialogue.
Open dialogue, where diverse interpretations can be explored and can potentially lead to even more innovative solutions.
Okay. It requires strong communication skills.
Yes.
Active listening, a willingness to engage in respectful debate, even when viewpoints clash.
Absolutely. And it also requires humility, would you say?
I would say so, yeah.
Recognizing that no one person has all the answers.
Right.
And that those collaborative solutions often lead to the best outcomes.
Right. And this kind of brings us full circle to that idea of participatory engagement that we talked about earlier.
It all ties together.
Yeah.
Quinean holism really encourages leaders to create those spaces where all voices can be heard and where decision-making is informed by this rich tapestry of perspectives.
It's about empowering stakeholders, not just including them for the sake of appearances.
It's about genuinely valuing their insights and recognizing that they hold crucial pieces of the puzzle.
And that, I think, is one of the most valuable takeaways from this entire deep dive.
I agree.
Quinean holism isn't just this abstract philosophical framework. It's a practical tool.
It's a powerful tool for building more effective and ultimately more successful organizations.
And as one of our sources eloquently puts it, in the world of FE governance, that web of belief is constantly being woven and rewoven.
Okay.
The key is to be aware of the threads, understand their connections, and contribute to the creation of a tapestry that reflects the richness and diversity of the entire college community.
That's a fantastic way to sum up this deep dive.
I thought so.
I hope our listeners have gained some valuable insights from exploring Quinean holism and its applications to FE governance.
It's been a real pleasure delving into these ideas with you.
Likewise, and to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery.
Yes, thank you.
We encourage you to continue exploring these concepts.
Yeah, keep thinking about it.
To embrace complexity and to see the world through that Quinean lens.
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep diving deep.